Hello everyone, the teachers and especially you beautiful candidates who will be sitting for a supplementary examination very soon. I hope this memo discussion will be assisting you in order to look at perhaps the mistakes that you may have made not so long ago in November and mistakes that have been made by other learners so that you learn from them and you don't repeat the same mistakes. I hope this will then help you so that you make it this time. And the shortfall that was due to the mistakes will not happen again. We wish you well and hope this will be a productive session for you. And your teachers will assist you in order to make it. Right. Let us start. Before we start, perhaps, let me say, I'm Palisa Buoi, the subject advisor for economics and accounting in the Clarib district. Here we go. Paper 1, November 24, 14 memo discussion. Remember the paper was out of 150 marks. It was a 1.5 hours paper. As we go through the paper, please stay with me because there are other things I would like to discuss you towards the end of this paper. Now let us look at the very important thing that you need to do every time when you sit for examination, the instructions. If you look at the instructions of this paper, section A is compulsory, you have to answer it. Section B, you have to answer any of 2 of the 3 questions. And then section C, 1 of the 2 essay questions. Answer only the required number of questions. Answers in excess of the required number will not be marked. This is very important because any question that you answer after the required number of questions will not be marked, and sometimes it is the very question in which you got better marks, and unfortunately we are guided by the instructions. Number the answers correctly according to the numbering system used in this question paper. No other answering numbering system. Write the question numbers above each question and then read the questions carefully, because if you read the questions carefully, you'll answer the questions accordingly. Start each question on a new page. That makes your work very neat and nothing will be omitted as marking is done. Leave 2 to 3 lines between the subsections of the questions. Answer the questions in full sentences and ensure that the format, content, as well as the context of your response comply with the cognitive requirements of the question. The question 1 is of lower order, middle, and higher order. That is what is meant by cognitive requirements. Use only a black pen or a black ink pen. That is all. You may use a non-programmable calculator, and please write in such a way that whoever marks your script is not in question of what a letter or word or phrase is actually supposed to mean. It must be neat and it must be legible. Right, let's get to section A then of the compulsory section. Whoa. Right, let's look question 1, 1.1.1. Various options are provided as possible answers to the following questions. Choose the answer and write only the letter A to C next to the question number. 1.1.1 to 1.1.8 in the answer book. There is an example given as to how your response should look like. Right, the first question, the flow of money from the financial sector into the economy is called, what is it called? Right, remember as you answer the multiple choice, I will not repeat this, I'm doing it now because this is the beginning of the paper. It's either you know the answer, you go straight to the answer and say, okay, here we have the flow of money from the financial sector into the economy, which means this is an inflow and therefore we have injections. Or you don't know the answer and you decide to say expense, you don't remember that as being a flow of money, Two, from the financial sector into the economy, leakage. You remember when there's leakage, that is an outflow. Therefore, the economy is not growing because of the leakage. Then you go to injection. Or if that is the second way of approaching, you are unable to do that, then rather choose any of those to increase your chances of at least getting a mark. Never ever leave a blank space. That is not really acceptable. Right, there is the answer, there is the leakage. Just to remind you of the leakages and the injections. If we can just find the leakages and injections. Remember, when we talk about the leakages, we said it refers to the outflow of money from the economy. There are examples of leakages: savings, taxation, payments for imports. And then the one that was required in your question was injections, refers to the inflow of money into the economy. The following are injections: investment, government expenditure, payment for exports. That was just a way of reminding you. Right, let us go on then. The transfer of ownership from the public to the private sector is known as what? That is known as a privatization. That is when the businesses are now owned by the private ownerships, whereas they were previously owned by the public, from public to the private sector. Right, the next question. The government income and expenditure estimates for a 3-year period are reflected in the what? Is it the provincial budget? Is it the main budget? Is the medium-term expenditure framework? The answer must be C. Now, the medium-term expenditure framework. Right, if we can look at the questions that we have done so far. 1.1 was well answered by most learners. They did not have a problem with that one. 1.1.2 also, of that of privatization, most of the learners were okay. But 1.1.3, most learners really did not know which of the budgets is the correct one. This indicated that they do not actually know the different forms of budget. This is the budget in the provinces. This is the annual budget that is normally tabled in February every year. This then becomes the correct budget. So you need to go back and find out or read more about this budget so that you do not make the same mistake should this question be assessed. Right, 1.1.4, define the course of action which is adopted by a group of organizations in an effort to promote best practices is known as what? There are your options: the policy, the strategy, the initiative. And the correct answer in this case then becomes the policy. When we look at this also, most of the learners really did not give the correct one. They gave the strategy. Understandably so, because policy is very close to strategy. But you need to look at certain ways that separates a distractor. Remember, a distractor is a response that looks right, but it is not necessarily correct. Now, if we go back to the question again, a definite course of action which is adopted by a group of people or is in an organization to promote the best practices is known as what? Right. A policy then must be adopted. And then from the policy, then one can develop strategies in order to realize the policy. So one has to first really understand the question very well. If you don't understand the question, you'll give the wrong response. It's like somebody who's asking you, what is your name? And you say, I'm going to Bloemfontein. That is not what is expected, and they'll be very surprised. So you need to understand the question. Okay, let's go on. That was just an example of if you give a wrong response, how does it feel to the person who assessed you and to yourself? Then it means you did not understand the question. 1.1.5. When the state uses tariffs to discourage import, it is called that. What is it called? Now the state, it is the government. It is using tariffs to do what? To discourage, to make people not want to import goods, but either to buy local produce or to export. But especially when it is discouraging imports, it says you are buying less and less of the foreign countries' items. Now, what is it used to do that? To discourage imports? Is it export promotion? No, it can be. Is it protectionism? No. It is protectionism. Is it monetary policy? Yes, it is protectionism. Because when we protect our industries, then we are trying to make sure that we are not buying the products that are from foreign, but we buy products that are from our own country. Because export promotion is just a policy that encourages to sell more to other countries. But monetary policy also regulates the economy through the interest rates. So the two cannot be correct, but protectionism must be then the correct answer. Although export promotion looks very close to the answer, but it is just a distractor. Like I said, a distractor sometimes is very close to the correct answer. 1.1.6. Geographical areas that have a wider industrial development. Geographical areas that have a wider industrial development objective and which can be located anywhere to promote cluster development is called corridors, special economic zones, manufacturing zones. It is called special economic zones. Right, when we look at this question 1.1.6, most of the candidates wrote the corridors, but the corridors is a tract of land that forms a passageway allowing access from one area to another and is developed as part of regional development. So one needs to then know what do we mean when we talk about the corridor, what do we mean when we talk about SEZs, and what do we mean when we talk about the manufacturing zones. But 1.1.5 was well responded to in November. Right, 1.1.7, aggregate supply can be stimulated through the government policy of reducing production costs, limiting the efficiency of inputs, lowering the productivity of production. And then we have the reducing production cost. But let us understand what the question says. Aggregate supply can be stimulated through the government policy of doing what? If we say aggregate supply can be stimulated, we are saying in general the supply of goods and services can be increased, that is stimulated. And how can that be done? It can be done by reducing the production cost. If the producers are paying less for making the goods available, then they are encouraged to produce more. That is what it means. But if we say limiting the efficiency of inputs, you are saying that the inputs that are supposed to be used in the production are not efficiently used, or they are not used to the fullest, and therefore, if they are not used to the fullest, we can't stimulate aggregate supply. Lowering the productivity of factors of production. Remember, productivity is increase in the production capacity. Now, if you lower the productivity of the factors of production, then we cannot stimulate the aggregate supply. Therefore, the correct answer in this case becomes reducing the production costs. This question was also very well answered by most of the learners. I think they understood what was required of them in this case. There was no problem. Right, let's go to the next question. The next question is: the institute that monitors empowerment and transformation through a code of good practice is known as, is it the Reserve Bank, is it the Industrial Development Corporation, or is it the Department of Trade and Industry? The correct answer is the Department of Trade and Industry. Right, when you look at this question, a lot of the learners in November did not get it right. Most of them, they either wrote the South African Reserve Bank, which is not really correct, because you remember the Reserve Bank is the one that controls, using the monetary policy, controls the amount of economic activities occurring. Right. And then let us then go to, okay, let me see what was not happening here. Something else happened here. Right. And then when you look at the DTI, the DTI, we have there the DTI reviews regulatory system in the area of competition, consumer protection, and so on and so on. This was not well answered, as I have already indicated. Right. Now we come to 1.2. Still the objective questions. Still question 1. Choose from the description from column B that matches an item in column A. Write only A to I next to the question number 1.2.1 to 1.2.8 in the answer book. There we have the words and the suggested responses. If I may advise you, in order to complete this very quickly, you can realize that according to this, you must read real flows, then go to the responses and read all the responses. And these responses are longer than the options in section A. And if I were you, my learner, this is what I would do. I would rather read here and go to this side. But if you are to do that, you must ensure that before you do that, you have numbered 1.2.1, 1.2.2, and so on. Let us see if we can succeed to do that together. There I have my numberings. Then I go back to my questions and I look at A and say, provided by the state and used by all members of society. Then I go to the column A, and then I realize, okay, real flows, recession, public goods. Then I see public goods provided by the state and used by all members of the society, because there's no exclusion, therefore it must be public goods. Then I'll go to my 1.2.3 and then just put in there A. Then I go to the next question. The next one that I must match measures the changes in prices of goods and services. Then B. Then I go to these because these are short. Real flows, recession, terms of trade, World Bank, Integrated Manufacturing Development Bank of South Africa, Consumer Price Index. It measures changes in the price of goods and services. What is that? It is consumer index. Then I go there and I say that was B. And then we go to the next one. It strengthens the institutional capacity and facilitates development. Right, I go through real flow, recession, at that one, terms of trade, World Bank, Integrated Manufacturing Strategy, Development Bank of South Africa. It strengthens the institutional capacity and facilitates development. It must then be Integrated Manufacturing Strategy. And that was, what was that? That was C. Then I go there, and then I say, no, not A, but C. Right. the flow of goods and services. It's real flow in the circular flow, remember? Then I just go D. And then promotes development in Southern Africa. Real flows, that was done. It says promotes development in Southern Africa. And then it can be public goods, it can be World Bank. It must then be Development Bank of South Africa. Let's see, Development Bank of South Africa promotes development in the African region. That is what? That is E. E, which is 7. And then I do F, the international institutes that promotes economic recovery and development. That is the World Bank. That is the World Bank, which is F. Then I go to G, a negative economic growth for at least 2 consecutive quarters. And that then becomes, let's just see, it becomes a recession. Then I just go there and say G. And then the flow of income and expenditure. The flow of income and expenditure. Right, that is how then you go on and on until you have the flow of income and expenditure, consumer price development, integrated World Bank, no. Right, you go the ratio between export price and import prices, then that would then be, let me see, the terms of trade. Then you go there and say what symbol was that? It was I. This way, it's not necessarily the only approach, but I was trying to show you that if you read the longer one and look at the options which are shorter, you save time. But if you look at the real flow, then you have to read all these phrases before you can come to which one really explains real flow. But whichever one works for you, go for it. Let us check the responses in line with the memo. There you have the responses then. I hope we have also done them correctly as the memo dictates. Right, let's go now to 1.3. Give one term for each of the following descriptions. Write only the term next to the question number. There, 1.1.3, 1.3.6 in the answer book. 1.3.1, an economy that includes the foreign sector, that is the open economy or a 4-sector model. A number of learners really did do well in this question because they do understand the open economy. And when you remember, we have an open economy and a closed economy. In the closed economy, that is where we do not have the foreign sector. 1.3.2, the short-term and the very short-term market for savings and loans. The answer is supposed to be the money market. And surprisingly, a lot of learners here, instead of writing the money market, they actually wrote the financial market. Remember, the financial market is the market in which the financial securities are traded. And therefore, a lot of learners here did not get this mark because they did not write the money market, but they wrote the financial market. So be careful should this type of question in any form, either whether you have it in matching or any other form, you need to be careful to differentiate between money market as well as the financial market. Right, let us look at this one now. 1.3.3, a curve that shows a relationship. It is a curve that shows a relationship. Remember, when we illustrate by means of a graph, there are two factors involved. In this case, they talk about the tax rates as well as their taxable income. So if we were to draw our graph, according to this, let's see if we can find the Laffer curve. If we were to draw the graph, where we have, there is the relationship. Remember, in a graph, we can have any other thing that it can be the price and the quantity or any other thing. In this case, we talk about the tax revenue as well as the tax rate. You remember this curve where we are saying at this, that is where the highest tax they can get. Other than that, when you go this side, people are not willing to pay as much tax. And here at 100, people are not willing to work at all. This is the curve that we're talking about. But they did not ask you in this case to draw the graph. But what did they do? They gave you the question and said, in that curve that they are thinking about, in relationship revenue and the tax are being illustrated. So you need to then remember that we are now therefore referring to this, the Laffer curve. That is the one that we have just displayed on the screen. Right, let us look at the other one. The worldwide interaction of economies. Right, before we go to that, let me just talk about the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve, a lot of learners really knew what the relationship that is being illustrated is. That is the Laffer curve. But many of the learners wrote spelling that we did not know what that meant. The lofa, the ilovo, and they went on with the different spelling mistakes. So as we practice, also try and practice how a word is being written so that your responses are really nice and correct. So majority spelled that one incorrectly. Right, 1.3.4, the world interaction of economies with trade as a key element. A lot of learners, I would say a lot of you because you also wrote, globalization, free trade, international trade, and foreign trade were different responses that were given there, and most of the learners really got that response correct. There was no problem there. The rate at which the banks borrow money from the Reserve Bank, the repo rate or repurchase rate, if you remember very well, this was on the news, I think it was yesterday, that the repo rate would stay the same. It has not been changed because as soon as the repo rate changes, it affects also the rate at which you also borrow money from the banks. So this was also a response that many of you got right. So I take it you understood, you followed the discussions yesterday. The last one on this section, the removal of unnecessary regulations that inhibit the free trade, free operation of markets. This is normally a question that you'll have also in the matching and so on, also in the multiple choice, deregulation. As soon as we have removal, then we deregulate. In other words, we're making more and more of the rules less. We reduce the rules so that more trade can happen, maybe formally as well as informally. Right, so the marks there were 30 marks. Hopefully, when you go and sit for exam, you'll collect the 30 marks. Because in this section, really, most of the learners collected a lot of marks. Marks were in the pocket. After you write this, marks must come to mama. These are free marks. People, work on that. Section B. Now, when you look at the section B, we have short questions that are response questions, as well as those medium questions of discussion of about 8 marks. Let us do this now. Answer 2 of the 3 questions in this section in the answer book. Remember, you are writing only on 2 modules, the macro and the economic pursuits. So of the 3 questions, 1 question will be purely macro, the other one will be purely pursuits, and the other one will be combination of pursuits and the macroeconomics. Remember the time, 20 minutes. List 2 methods used to calculate the national income aggregates. There they stated the 3 methods as those are the methods that can be used: the production method, the income method, and the expenditure method. Some of the learners would just write value added or the GPI income, the GDP income or the GDP expenditure. That is also acceptable. Some of the books have also just done that. When we look at the production method, we look at the usage of the factors. When we look at the income, we look at what the people are receiving. And when we look at the expenditure, how much has been used in order to make those final goods available. So we can either approach it from any of these, and then when we add, the answer that we come to must still be the same. We have just approached the answer from the different angles, using the production, using the income, or using the expenditure. When we looked at how learners have performed in this question, really most of the learners in this question responded incorrectly. I don't know what happened, because when you look into your books, you also have the calculations of the production method, the income method, and the expenditure method in some books. And when you look at the answer that they get when they use the methods, then the answer is the same. You need to go and acquaint yourselves with these methods. 2.1.2, how will the contraction phase of the business cycle influence the economy through the interest rates? Now remember, when you talk about the contraction phase, I don't know if I can get that. Let me see if I can get the business cycle somewhere here. Right, if we look at the business cycle, we have our contraction phase and then we have our expansion phase. So our contraction phase, therefore, we have our recession and depression. Now the question is, how can the interest rates influence this? Right, now if we look at our response, let me just go back to my response again. Let me go back to the response. They say here, in the later stage of the downswing, interest rates will decrease. More people will borrow money to stimulate the economy. But in the early stage of the downswing, interest will increase, and to dampen the economy, people will borrow less money. So what happens? When the interest rate increase, nobody wants to pay the interest rates that are high, because that is now not cost effective. So what happens? That dampens the economy. But what happens in the later stage of the downswing? Because there's recession now, we want to revive the economy. We want to stimulate the economy. Then the interest rates will be decreased. The lower the interest rates, remember who does that? The Reserve Bank. The lower the interest rates, the more people are encouraged to take loans to either do more production and so on. So the economy will be stimulated. And that is now indicated here, that in the early stages, that is where the interest rate is high. But in the late stages, can you see now? It is like it's becoming worse. When it gets worse, we want to go up. In order to go up, we reduce the interest rates. But here in the early stages, we are almost close to a situation where the economy was too high, there was too much inflation, and we want to reduce the amount of money in the economy. Then the interest rates are still a little bit high here, because we are still in the prosperity, closer to the prosperity. That is the early stages. But here, these are the late stages. And the late stages, we reduce the interest rate to pick up. Right, I hope you understand the issue of the interest rates, and hopefully I can also hear myself. Right, let's go to a data response question now. Now, when you go to data response question, you will realize that it's a pattern. It's either there's an extract, or there's a picture, or there's a graph. In the same question, there's two, one picture, one extract, or one extract, one graph, and so on. Now, in this case, study the information below and answer the questions that follow. There is the picture, the economic forecast, adapted from the internet. Economic indicators are statistics used to measure some aspects of the economy, which helps to focus business cycles. For example, unemployment rates, retail sales, and job advertising space. Besides economic indicators, the length and the amplitude of the business cycle are other factors that underpin the forecasting of business cycle. The Reserve Bank also compiles composite indicators to reflect the performance of the economy. Let's look at what they want from us. Identify a leading economic indicator from the above data. Right, if you look at it, if you go back, we have unemployment, retail sales, job advertising space as indicators. But they do not want any of the indicators. They want specifically which one? They want a leading indicator. And if they are looking for the leading indicator, then it becomes the job advertising. If job is advertised, then we know there's better days to come. I want us to just go back to the indicators to remind you what must happen. You remember, if we talk about the leading indicators, these must be the indicators that change before the economy change. That is why there will be job advertising, then there will be growth. But lagging economic indicators, they do not change direction until after the business cycle has changed direction. And then we have coincidental economic indicators. They simply move at the same time as the economy moves. Now, I want to refer you, I think this is a 2009 paper. Let me see. Yes, this is a 2009 paper. This will help you a lot, guys. First, understand the indicators. After understanding the indicators, go and look at the examples that have been given. I have a shopping list of them here, like the leading indicators. You have the number of new vehicles sold, and so on. There is the job advertising in Sunday Times. Can you see that? So job advertising was the correct one. All the others were indicators that fall into the other indicators, either coincidental or lagging indicators. So go back, look at the paper of 2009 so that you can see the examples and you understand what is going on as far as the indicators are concerned. Right, so our response in this case that indicates leading becomes job advertising space. Define the term composite indicator. Now, when you talk about the composite indicator, it is said it's a summary of various indicators of the same type into one single index. What does that mean? It means we take different indicators, we use them together, and then we can give say a forecast or an understanding of the direction of the economy and so on. So when it is composite, it means it is more than one indicator. So let's just see there it says summary of various indicators. That is what we wanted to see into into a single index. The three composite indicators are used to calculate a single composite indicator to benchmark a country's economic performance and so on. If you said anything about bringing together indicators, that would have earned you marks. Remember, if you don't know something, also tap into language, because composite means a combination of a number of things. If your economics knowledge fail you, tap into your English knowledge. Right. What does the amplitude of the business cycle demonstrate? Let us look. It demonstrates the power of underlying forces. It demonstrates the extent of change, the amplitude, the strength of the large amplitude shows the strength of underlying forces. But while we are here, I think we need to, if you are to explain these, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want us just to check how an amplitude looks like. Now, if you look at this, for an example, can you see how the amplitude looks like? We can measure it from here, like this. You go this way as you measure the amplitude. And therefore, it is from, if I say this, I'm trying to say it is at this point, you go to this point. Now, if we go back then, after understanding what an amplitude is, you also can go and say, I want that specific one. I want that specific one that says, the amplitude demonstrates the distance from peaks and troughs, and it is measured from the trend line. Can you see? Even if you were not sure, but if you understand how an amplitude looks like, you are likely also to give some of the correct responses, because it says, what does the amplitude of the business cycle demonstrate? And if you know where the how to measure the amplitude and how it stands, then you can be able to get a number of marks. How did the learners fare in this question? I think candidates confused the amplitude with the length, and they were, however, able to score marks on the length of the business cycle, but they struggled to get marks on the amplitude itself. Right, let's look at this. Explain the length of the business cycle as a feature that underpins forecasting. Let's go back again to our, is this the same one? Yes. If we look at it, when you go for amplitude, that's how we measure it. But when we measure the length, that is how we go. In other words, we move from here to here. But when we measure the amplitude, that is how we go. And therefore, you do not have to confuse the two when you explain whatever you need to explain. So when you look at explanation of the length of the business cycle as a feature underpinning forecasting, we have here, it is measured from peak to peak and from trough to trough, because we are going that direction. It's the time used to move through the complete cycle. Ne? So the longer the cycle, the longer cycles are stronger and the shorter cycles are weaker. That is depending on how close the peak to peak is from each other, or trough to trough is from each other. So you need to know, guys, what is amplitude, what is the length of the cycle, so that you can be able to, even if you don't say things like cycles may overshoot, but at least most of the learners were able to talk about things like it is measured from peak to peak and end 2 marks if they did not get all the marks. So the understanding of your graphs is paramount. Let's go to 2.3. Study the table below and answer questions that follow. This extract is from the balance of payment. We have there the capital transfer account, we have the financial account, we have the balance on the financial account, we have unrecorded transactions, and then we have changes in the gold and other foreign reserves. If we go to the questions, the first question says, which item captured in the South African business that purchases property in the United States of America. They say it is the net direct investments. That is the one that captures a South African business that buys property in the United States of America. So it means here you must first know the components of your balance of payment, and you must also know under each component what is constituted there, what aspects are being explained under each. What is current account, what is under current account, what is the financial account, what is under financial account, and so on and so on. What is nice about the balance of payment is that you don't have to have the figures in your head. You only have to understand the balance of payment itself, because you'll always be provided with the figures for interpretation and explanation and the calculations perhaps where they are needed. Right, define the term balance of payment. A systematic record of all transactions between one country and another country or the rest of the world for a specific period of time, 1 year. Now, normally, you need to write it like this, because the examiner, when the examiner wants to give 2 marks, there are 2 important things. The transactions, it must be all the transactions of that particular country, one country. And that country must be trading with the other countries to say we have a balance of payment. And sometimes, if they allocate marks, this would have also been allocated marks. Usually, we do the balance of payment for a period of 1 year. And this question, most of the candidates explained what here. Let me see. The candidates, okay, gave the correct answer on this question. So it was, I want to see what did the candidates do. Pardon me. Candidates merely repeated the phrasing of the question without demonstrating the understanding of the concept. So that was a problem, because then they were not really explaining what the answer was here on this one. Let us look at it. This one, 2.3.3. What is the purpose of the item unrecorded transactions? To capture the effect of errors, omissions, and timing differences. Incorrect explanation when they say should not taken to incorrect explanation to the balance of payment should not be taken as correct. In other words, this was instruction to us not to give marks, because learners were also saying to balance the account. I mean, you know accounting, but that does not mean much to us if you say you are balancing the account, because we need to know why is there a shortage, why is there a discrepancy. We are saying there are certain transactions that took place later that were not taken into account, or there were mistakes that happened, that is errors, that needs to be taken, because sometimes the timing difference, the occurrence of the transaction and the time when the recordings are taking place. But what most learners did, they just said the purpose of the item of the unrecorded transaction is to record unrecorded transactions. That did not tell us much, and learners lost marks because they are telling us what we have already asked them, word for word, and that was not acceptable, learners, my candidates. Right, the 2.3.4, if the balance on the current account was 164,548, calculate the value for changes in the net gold and other foreign reserves. Show all calculations. Very important, if they say show all calculations, the marks will be distributed accordingly. If you give us only the answer, you'll only get a mark maybe for the answer, but you will not get all the marks because you have not addressed the question as asked. Show all. Right, when we look at this, we have here the balance on the current account. It is a minus because it was a negative. We add the capital transfer account. We add the balance on the financial account. We add the unrecorded transactions, and then we get the changes in the net gold and other foreign reserves. If you look at the memo, it says here, minus for any other irrelevant or faulty or double counting. A lot of learners in this question did a lot of double counting. Why did they do a lot of double counting? I want to believe it is because of misunderstanding of what is happening. For example, if they take the balance on the financial account, I think we must go back to the question paper. Let's go to the question paper. Can you see the financial account? Under financial account, we have net direct investments, we have net portfolio investments, we have other investments. And then these are added to get the balance on the financial account. So what the learners do, let's go back to the answer again. What the learners do, instead of adding the balance on the financial account, then they go back and add the balance on the financial account, but they also add, I want to go back again, they also add these items, but these items are already in this figure, and therefore you should ignore these figures. But if you don't understand the balance of payment, that is going to cause the very problem that we had, where learners had a lot of these double counting that is referred to here. I want to go to the simplified balance of payment just to show you what I mean by what we say when we say you should not add the items that are not necessary. Let's look at the balance of payment for an example. A full one. Let me see if I can just reduce it a little so that we have the whole picture of this thing. Right. We have the current account. We have the capital transfer account. We have the financial account. We have, now, this was what you were asked to calculate, the changes in the net gold and other foreign reserves to the balance of payment. So what is happening? The current account, although we have these items, eventually we have the balance. So we take just the balance. We have the capital transfer account, which we must add. We take the financial account. The financial account, we don't take everything. We just take the balance of the financial account, because this is composed of these. Now, what the mistake that candidates do is to take this and add these again, but these are already in here. Can you see that? So you have to take this figure, take this figure, take this figure, get to this figure. That is what was supposed to have happened. Like I said, with the balance of payment, there's no need to have the figures in your head. In any case, it changes from time to time. Understand it so that you are able to respond. Because at times, in this case, you were asked to do the changes in net gold and other foreign reserves. But in some questions, if you remember the previous question papers, what they will do, they want to know if you know the components that will end up having this balance. Then they say, maybe they remove this one, or they add another one, which does not belong to the financial account, which belongs to, say, current account, and say which one does not belong here, and so on. So you need to know the accounts and then the different aspects or elements which are composed within each account. Then you will not go wrong at all. Right, now we go to our medium type of questions. Compare the free floating exchange rate as well as the managed floating exchange rate. Here, the question wanted you to compare. Now, if you were to compare, it means what must happen then? It means you must say maybe the free floating can be, say, defined as exchange rate which are determined by the market forces of demand and supply. But this one, as opposed to that one, is a system where the central banks intervenes in the exchange rates, market stabilizing in the exchange rate market, stabilizing the currency, making the currency to be stable, in other words. But if it was not a direct comparison as the question requested, marks were still allocated to the learner. So if you think, right, now that I talked about the demand and supply being in control, the central bank, you can't remember what happens here. Write any other aspects that you think is relevant under managed floating exchange rate. So they don't necessarily have to correlate. But for a learner who knows what is doing, then the comparison will be spot on. But in the case where it is not spot on, you are still free to give the points. Remember, first you know, second you give it your best shot. Right. So here we had most of the learners could understand the different exchange rate systems, but they did not get sufficient points. Remember, this is an 8-mark question. There must be 4 marks for the free floating and 4 marks for the managed floating. So what happened? Maybe the learner will only say, okay, here in the free floating, demand and supply is determining, and then here the central bank, and then is determining by intervening through the exchange rates, and that is all. Then you are not getting the full marks because you'll only get 2 marks there, 2 marks there. Whereas if you added more information, you could get your full 4 marks for the other and full marks for the next one. Right, let's go to 2.5. 2.5. Here it was discussed there, multiplier and its aggregate effect on the economy. If the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC is 0.6 and the investment increases by 10 million. So what you need to do, you need to first have the formula. If you don't know the formula, you can't do the calculation. If you look at the verbs, it says discuss the multiplier. Right, and it says here, look at its aggregate effect on the economy. Now, in order for you to say that, to talk about the effect, you must be able to say how it has changed. Now, if we take there, for an example here, the definition, okay, a relatively small investment produces a proportionally larger increase in national income. That was not a problem. And then we come to the formula where we have the multiplier formula, or alternatively, you can use it from the consumption or the savings point, where then you use the information that has been given. The formula 1/1 minus MPC, the marginal propensity to consume. There we have been given it as 0.6, then you put it there, then you get that. But if you use the formula of 1 over the marginal propensity to save, then you say 1. But remember, this is equals to 1. 0.1 and 0.4 then give us the 1. Then what happens then? We say instead of the 0.46, we then use the savings, which is the marginal propensity to save, which is 0.4. Then it should give us the same answer. But other learners now who are mathematically inclined also gave us this. And this was, although this is not the formula that most of us know, but we took it and used it. The learner actually used the equation and then had the unknowns there. 0.6 is y plus 10, and then because there is the 10 plus the 10 must therefore give us, and then change that to the subject of the formula, which is the y, which is the unknown. This y then is, we don't know what is the size of the multiplier, therefore it is the y, and then ended up giving us what? It gave us eventually the multiplier effect, which is the 25 billion, which is the same as this one. So this was also accommodated as correct. Okay. And then you also had to go further. Let's look at the question. It says you must discuss the multiplier and its effect. Once you have said what the multiplier is, you have discussed that, but you must go into its effect. Therefore, if we invest 10 billion, we'll produce 25 billion, which is the effect, which is the increase in the national income. If the candidate shows the graphical presentation, that was also accepted, but the bottom line is you should have understood what a multiplier is and then use the information that you have been given into the formula in order to calculate what was required here. And then I must say this question of the multiplier. Most of the learners would not be able to explain, but most of them got this part of the answer correct. So it means they understand the formula and the calculation, but they need to understand the reasoning behind. That is what we need to take care of now, because the multiplier is no longer a monster that seems to have been in the past. That was question 2. Let us look at economic pursuits. Question 3. When we get to economic pursuits, very important, I'll always say time, because time is of essence. That is what really got most of our learners disadvantaged or could not finish, and therefore whatever is left in your modular does not count if it's not in black and white. So you need to make sure that you finish in time. Right, 3.1.1, list any 2 monetary policy instruments. Let me just get distracted a little. List any 2 monetary policy instruments used by the Reserve Bank. I think we have referred to a Reserve Bank for quite a while now, but these are the instruments used: the interest rates, the open market transaction, the moral suasion or persuasion, cash reserve requirements, and then the exchange rate policy. Those are the tools at their disposal. They can either increase or decrease in the interest rates depending or whatever, or use any of these. Encourage people to save more and so on and so on. They can tap into any of these instruments to either steer the economy into growth or into another direction, depending. 3.1.2. And before we go to 3.2 to 3.1.2, I want to say this question was not answered correctly, the one of the Reserve Bank, surprisingly, because the learners confused monetary policy with fiscal policy. And the most of the learners or the candidates wrote the tax and government spending. People do not make this mistake. Remember, we can steer the economy in either direction by using either the government or using the Reserve Bank. And when we use the government, then that is when we can talk about the tax. Say, for an example, we want to reduce the economic activities. What do? We increase tax. When we increase tax, people have less money. They have less money, there's less spending. If you want to, we can reduce tax. If we reduce tax, people have more money. When people have more money, there's more spending. Which policy is that? It becomes fiscal policy. But say, for an example, we increase interest rates, we discourage people from borrowing money, there's less spending. We decrease the interest rates, people borrow money, there's more spending. Which policy is that? That becomes the monetary policy. So you do not have to confuse the fiscal policy with the monetary policy, because it is also not steered from the same organization. The other one is by the government and the other one is by the Reserve Bank. And the one by the government, remember, we always hear that from especially the tabling of the budget. Thank you. I hope that will not happen again. Right, 3.1.2. Why are economic indicators important to the government? Right, remember, we have economic indicators and we have social indicators. So you need to know what do we mean when we talk about the economic indicators. What does the government then use the economic indicators for? The government use it for budgetary planning purpose. And then the economic indicators are also used for policy planning. They are used to assess where are we in terms of the economy. Right, while I'm here, maybe I can just remind you of that. If I can find that document and say, remember, we can either talk about economic indicators or we can talk about social indicators. Now the question there is the usage of the economic indicators by the government. Which ones are economic indicators? These ones that are relating to the economy. Social are more related to people's state of being and so on. Now these ones, the inflation indicators relating to foreign trade, what is the rate of unemployment, how are we far in terms of productivity, the GDP indicators relating to interest rate, how much money we have in the economy, those are economic indicators. And we talk about the economic indicators. The question there says, if the government has this, why is it so important to them? What do they do with this? And that is what you were supposed to say or answer. Because if they do the budgeting, then they must know where the what is the situation with the inflation. Can now we reduce the taxes? Can we increase the taxes? Do we want to dampen the economy? Do we want to stimulate the economy? Those are the things that they need to know. And then they can assess also what is the situation in terms of economy. Right. I have not referred to all the indicators, but combined together, they will be used for different purposes as stated here. Let's go to 3.2. Study the extract below and answer the questions that follow. Buy Back South Africa. This campaign is an initiative of the Department of Trade and Industry, the DTI. Remember, we had this, I think, somewhere in there. Objective questions. Manufacturing Circle and Proudly South African. It is directed towards the purchase of South African manufactured products. It forms part of the government strategy of growing the economy. It is important to strengthen and diversify the country's industrial base to develop export markets. However, the European Union has banned the imports of contaminated citrus fruits from South Africa. This was adapted from the business report, November 2013. Let us look at the questions then. Okay. The first question we have here, 3.2.1, which government department initiated the buyback campaign? This campaign is an initiative of the Department of Trade and Industry. So you didn't have to go very far to get the answer. What does the government intend to achieve through this campaign? What is it trying to do? Right, if you look at the answers, to strengthen and diversify the country's industrial base, raising the competitive value of export to the rest of the world, growing the economy, developing the traditional export, promoting the purchase of African manufactured products. But if you go back and look at the extract itself, some of the things that we have said, like growing the economy, diversifying the country's industrial base, develop export market, are actually in the extract itself. If you understand the extract first time, then you know that some of the answers you can get here. But not necessarily all answers will be here. If we try to say, buy back South Africa, you can also think of the value of that yourself and add other things if everything else fails. Right, where are we now? We are on 3.2.3. But before we go to 3.2.3, let us see. Okay. This question was also answered well, because a lot of you could see that you can actually get the answers from the extract. That was good, my learners, given the fact that you have to work fast, because these 1 marks mean that you need more time. 3.2.3, how can the government benefit from diversifying the country's industrial base? Producing different products. In other words, producing greater variety of goods and services will increase government revenue. Okay, let's go back to the question. How can the government benefit from diversifying the country's industrial base? The advantages of producing more than one item. That's what this question is trying to say. So what is the advantage of that? Producing a greater variety of goods and services, that makes money to come in, more revenue. Improve infrastructure delivery, then there must be an improvement in the way we transport the goods, like the roads and so on. The government will be able to meet the objectives of growth. The more goods we can produce, the more our growth will be, and price stability also. And any other answers that were relevant were considered. But when the answers are said to be relevant, they must make sense in terms of the question that was posed. How can the government benefit from diversifying their industrial base? Right, I will not dwell a lot on this one. We have already exhausted it in a way. Right, 3.2.4. Negative effects what negative effect might the banning of citrus imports by the European Union have on the local citrus producers? If we go back to our extract again, I'll go back and forth. However, the European Union has banned the imports of contaminated citrus fruit from South Africa. Remember, in order to understand the question, you need to know who is buying from whom. In this case, the Europeans were buying from us, and now they say no more. That's the direction. You need to know the direction in order to respond. Now, we'll have loss of production, because now they don't have the market to which they were selling anymore. Our factories or our companies, they lay off, people will be unemployed. If there's less market to sell to, then profit is not made, people will be unemployed. Decrease in income, you are not making more profit. Downscaling of business, either you had a business that was maybe having 3 buildings for production. Now if you must produce less, you are downscaling. Then also poverty may increase. And if the answer was not here, we need to look what negative effect might banning of imports by the European. In other words, whatever response must make sense as per question as we see it there. Right. 3.3, the cartoon. The famous chink cartoon. 3.3. Study the cartoon and extract below and answer questions that follow. There's a chink in my armor. I am a black Chinese South African. BEE, great. And then we have there the purpose of most recent BEE summit was to scrutinize the last decade of the BEE system. Efforts were in place to improve the system, although they still face several problems, such as companies using fronting to sidestep prescribed legal requirements, as well as verification of the BEE levels of companies. There is a serious shortage of black industrialists in the country. Therefore, transformation is needed in the sector. That was the cartoon. And then there's a question. There's BEE question. What is the aim of the Black economic empowerment? Why is the Black economic empowerment? Remember, the Black economic empowerment was to redress or to correct the inequalities of the past, to give the blacks also, to empower is to make better, and therefore to give more ability to the blacks and opportunities to make it for themselves in their work environment. Empower the black people, and any other relevant response that had to do with that was also accepted in terms of the Black economic empowerment. Right. Like we said, some of the answers will not necessarily find in the extract itself, but first try to see if you can get those there. If you can't, remember this, the aim. Let me go back. The aim of Black economic empowerment, it's stated just as is in your exam guideline. Therefore, it means you should have known what are the aims of the BEE. What challenges does the BEE policy currently face? We have the verifying the BEE levels of companies, fronting, fronting where they say this company is black owned, when they have taken some people who have no clue what they are doing in the company. They are just there as workers, but they are said to be the owners of the company. That is the fronting, corruption, nepotism, of hiring your own when they don't qualify, and so on and so on. Still, there's a shortage of black industrialists. Those are the challenges of the BEE. Despite the fact that blacks are to be empowered, there are certain stumbling blocks that make BEE perhaps to not thrive as it's supposed to thrive. And when you look at these, you actually have some of these responses, like I said. If you read carefully in the data response, sometimes you get the answers from the data itself. Let's look. We have the fronting, for an example, the verification and the others, the serious shortage and so on. You can still find the answers in the extract itself as long as you have comprehended the question. Explain the message depicted by the cartoon. You look at the cartoon and say, this cartoon in summary, it explains the following. So here it says, some industries misuse the benefits of BEE for their own greed. Some individuals, misuse the benefits of BEE for their own greed. And then you can see that before democracy, Chinese were classified as Asians. After democracy, Chinese were also classified as black. This emanates from the fact that this person who says there's a chink in my armor is perhaps a Chinese who says now I'm a black Chinese in South Africa. You see, that gives more or less the picture of what is happening. But some people also are claiming, I'm not saying the Chinese, are claiming to be black so that they benefit from this. That is why there they say, the cartoon explains that some people, because of greed, are using the BEE, which was well meant, in a very abusive and incorrect way. Have you realized I used other words except the one in the explanation? That is because, what do we mean? Any other relevant message. So I've said the same things, different words, therefore those can be granted marks because they're still meaning what is encompassed in the explanation here. Relevancy. In your opinion, why do you still experience a serious shortage of black industrialists in South Africa? We still have this problem because people do not have capital, they do not have money, they cannot afford the machineries to start the business sometimes. There's lack of training. Sometimes they do not know much in terms of what to do. That is lack of training and grooming of more black industrialists. Those could be the reasons. Some cannot access capital because there are certain requirements before you can get a loan, and so on and so on. Lack of exposure. Some people are also not aware of the opportunities out there. Believe me, there are a lot of opportunities for the youth and so on and so on in order to start your own business. But sometimes people are not exposed to such information. Those could be then the reasons why we still have not so many black industrialists in South Africa. For Max, briefly discuss the aims of regional development. This is also SEs in your exam guideline. It refers briefly discuss the aims of regional development. It refers to the policies which are aimed at increasing the economic livelihood of specific areas or regions to limit the effects of economic centralization. Right, let me start with the other one. Remember, we have the different regions or different places in the country. So now when we have regional development, it is targeting of those areas that are not necessarily productive, that are disadvantaged in terms of, say, there are no industries and so on. And when focus is on those industries, then it says we increase the economic livelihood, we increase production capacity in those areas so that we have people who are in either remote areas, if I may say so, that may stay there and be able to live a better life. And then we try to reduce the effects of economic centralization, reduce unequal development of economic activities. Right, if there's centralization, clustering of economic activities in particular areas. So when we have regional development, the aim is to make that clustering or centralization less, the effects of economic centralization. We have to promote the advantages of regional development, and we go on with those. Then you get your 8 marks. So your discussion must be covering a bit of a lot of things. But I think if you understand the aim of regional development, then we can be able to have these facts. We can go home with the explanation. The second, last, medium type of question, analyze population growth and life expectancy as a social indicator under demographics. Right, I want to first show the response and then go back to explaining this. Population growth. There we have it. It is determined by the birth rate, death rates, migration of people, South African population, numbered there. But if there's any information that you have that is most recent, that will be looked into. Life expectancy. This expresses the number of years a newborn infant will live. If the prevailing patterns of mortality remain the same throughout the person's life, then there we have the figures. So this all in all gave you the 8 marks. But I wanted to go to the indicators to show you what was required of you here. Because if I remember very well, yes, this question was poorly answered by most candidates. Most candidates failed to discuss population growth and life expectancy. Instead, they discussed the North and South divide. Right, let me go back then and look at this. Remember, we talked about economic indicators and social indicators. Now, this question is now on social indicators. Now, if we were to list the social indicators, these are then the social indicators. Indicators relating to demographics, indicators relating to nutrition and health, relating to education, to services, housing and urbanization. As we said, social indicators have to do more with the society or with the well-being of the people. Right. Now, the question did not want all these indicators. The question wanted you to focus on one indicator, and that indicator is this one, indicator relating to demographics. Let's just check. I've tried to have this extract for you. And then we go to social indicators. Now, indicators relating to demographics. Then under the demographics, the government and the business must know the size of the population. Demographics is about the numbers. Now you had to talk about the population growth, how the population is increasing, but also how long that population is expected to live, or the mortality rate of that population, where you had to explain the life expectancy and then refer to some of the figures in order to say more or less the mortality rate is, say, 52 in this year, in 2011, and so on and so on. So this had nothing to do with the other indicators, but one indicator tabling or explaining their particular elements in that indicator. Right, and then the learners did not do that. They failed to do that. Instead, they went to the north-south divide, which is totally something else that has to do with the countries that are well developed and other countries that are less developed and their characteristics. And that was not asked for. Remember what I said about when you answer what you are not asked for? It's like saying, what is your name? And you say, I live in Bloemfontein. That's not on. Right. Question 4, macroeconomics and economic pursuits. I said this at the beginning. When you do section B, you'll have one purely macro, one purely economic pursuit, and a mixture of macro and pursuits. This is the type of question then. Remember, 20 minutes. Answer the following questions. List 2 supply reasons for international trade. That is this natural resources, climatic conditions, labor resources, technical resources, specialization, capital. Remember, in this case, you are just to supply reasons for international trade. In a case where you are supposed to, maybe they can use the questions also, say in an 8 marks question, where they say, discuss maybe natural resource as a reason for international trade. That is now where you must go home with this and say, natural resources differ from one country to another, therefore it makes them to trade, and so on and so on. You go on with the different aspects. But in this case, you only had to name those aspects without elaborating on them. And most of the learners in this case, what did they do? Most of them were not able to answer this correctly. What is the main purpose of expanded public works program? Right, create employment using labor-intensive methods, giving people the skills that they need in order to find jobs. The EPW, the aim, yes, most of the learners, when they wanted to talk about the EPW, understandably, they've seen the people in their areas in, do you call them overalls? I'm not sure, working there. Then they just say the aim is to pick up papers, but actually the aim is to, those people, as they pick papers, it is because they are employed, they are going to be paid. And therefore, that is the main purpose. And they can do a different tasks as under this expanded public works program. So we were looking for, if you wrote a long story, but I can see that you meant something about employment, you still got marks, despite the long story. Despite the long story, marks were earned by most of the learners here. All right, let's go to 4.2. The question paper said, study the cartoon below and answer questions that follow. We have the BRICS trade protocol, the gateway to Africa. There's somebody there who says welcome. There's BRICS summit to be held. And then there are those countries, you know, the Brazil countries, and the Russia, the Brazil, China, and India that build BRICS. And then we have South Africa as that is. And then we have gateway to Africa. And then you can see what is happening there. Now, you have to go to the questions. Define the term protocol. Because you can see there's BRICS trade protocol. Then you need to know what that means. It means there's an agreement between the trade rules or guidelines between countries on how to trade with each other. Right, most of the learners here had poor performance because they were just general and not explaining the protocol correctly. So they failed actually to say there are rules. Remember what is very important here. There must be rules and there must be more than one country trading. So we needed to look at there's an agreement and there is two or more countries. If you just said between countries, that is acceptable. Explain the message depicted by the cartoon. As you see the cartoon, what do you see? The other members of BRICS are using South Africa to exploit the resources of Africa. Right, in other words, if you look at it here, it says gateway to Africa. So they enter here, not because they are only coming to South Africa, but they are also wanting to go into the inner zones, that is Africa as a whole. And that was the explanation. And then we had learners who would say South Africa is welcoming the other countries or BRICS countries. That is not fully correct, because although you are here, you need to look at the picture as a whole and say what is happening and give a summary of the whole picture in order to. That was very difficult because a lot of learners did not earn marks here because they were just giving one aspect which does not summarize the whole data response question or the cartoon. 4.2.3. Why is South Africa regarded as gateway to Africa? South Africa has developed infrastructure. That is true. South Africa is more stable politically. Financial and economic stability is there. And then it is largest or second largest economy in our sub-Saharan Africa. So it is an ideal entrance. Any of those was acceptable. How will South Africa benefit from the BRICS membership? These were the reasons. Then South Africa will benefit from being member of the, must I say BRIC or BRICS? Because S, that stands for South Africa. So in the BRICS, let me just say BRICS. In the BRICS, South Africa will benefit because it will have to advance its national interest. South Africa is able here to, what are the national interests, the increase of economic growth, full employment, and the others. Then it will be able to benefit because there is increased understanding for trade. with other countries, especially those that have been mentioned, which are part of the BRICS, to promote its regional integration program and related continental infrastructure program, to partner with key players of South on issues related to global governance and reform. South Africa membership of this body has expanded BRICS geographic and intercontinental reach, being able to venture into other countries. Then if you had any of these or others which are relevant to this, then you would have addressed this question. Why South Africa in BRICS? Is there any value of South Africa in being in BRICS? Are we benefiting? The question is, are we getting anything for being a member? And the answer is, these will be then the benefits. 4.3. Study the table below and answer the questions that follow. National income and production accounts, these are aggregates, remember, of South Africa. Compensation of employees, there you have net operating surplus, consumption of fixed capital, that gives us gross value added at factor cost. Other taxes on production and minus the subsidies, and then there is what is wanted. There is this figure. We had this figure, now we have this figure. What is happening? What is supposed to be that figure? We have the gross value added, or the GDP at basic price. Remember, first it was the factor cost, and then before the commodities are sold, we say this is the final, or this is the amount that the producers are saying this product before we take it to the market is worth this. That is why after they have done all the compensation, pay their employees and all the factor cost, then we say the other taxes on production. And then what were they subsidized with in order to have the value of the product lessened? In terms, no, not the value of the product, the cost that they have incurred to be lessened. That's what basically it means. Then we say eventually we have the gross value added at basic price. Now, when we have that, eventually now we say there's the product. Now, if there's taxation on the product and then the subsidies on the product, in this case, the subsidies which the consumer benefits from, then we have the gross domestic product at the market price, the price at which now the consumer may buy the product. Define the term gross domestic product. What does the term gross domestic product mean? Let me just see what was the general response here. Question 4.3 was poorly answered. I think you need to go back, and I understand that, and different examples can be used really by the teachers to make this an easy to understand content. And then most candidates seem not to understand at what stage is the calculation made. If the learners can understand, make use of a simple product, then go through these with the learners, then they'll understand why are we saying we are at factor cost, why are we saying we are at basic price, and why are we saying we are now at the market price. Okay, define the term gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, really, it is the total of all final goods and services produced within the boundaries of the country for a specific period, usually a year. This is very important. the final goods and services. Remember, in the production process, sometimes the goods are yet with the factories and they are not even here. They are not at this stage of the market price. They are somewhere here. They are somewhere here where they are still in the production process. Those are not considered to be part of the domestic product. When the goods are in the market, are at their final stage, then they become part of the gross domestic product. And that production must not happen anywhere. It must happen within the boundaries of the country. It doesn't matter who does the production, whether it's the citizens of the country or it's somebody else who is in the country, then it becomes the domestic product. I normally say, make use of products that the learners understand, then it will be easier for them to understand these and then relate to the content. If you take an orange, we take the orange from the farmer. If they are sold directly to the consumer, then they'll become part of the final product. If you take oranges for an example, and then we want to turn the oranges into the orange juice, while they are busy being turned into the orange juice, they are not part of the final product. But the orange juice, when it is complete and done and ready for the market, becomes part of the final product. So the product must be at a stage where no production will still take place or processing will take place on it. Then it becomes part of the final goods as well as the services, and then important within the boundaries for a period like usually a year. Explain the item consumption on fixed capital. Consumption on fixed capital, the cost of using capital or the machinery. So that was 2 marks. And if we said the depreciation on the use of fixed asset, that was the mark. Or if you said the diminishing value of an asset. This consumption of fixed capital is the usage of the capital, and as you use the capital, it diminishes in value. And most of the learners, I think those who were doing accounting, referred to it as depreciation, and they were also allocated marks. Calculate the gross domestic price at the market price B. Show all calculations. As soon as they say show all, show all. For an example, we have the gross value added at basic price. Can we go back to, there comes the back and forth again. We are here now. So we were asked what is this? We said is the GDP at basic price. But we had this value. Now they want this value. So it means what is happening, you must remember now. It's 2820, 262. That is at a basic price. But now what happens? It means there's a taxation on the items which must be added, and then because there's a subsidy, that must also be subtracted. Then there is the 20086, which is subtracted, because remember what I said? I said the subsidy lessens what the impact that the price would have had on the consumer. But the taxation is that amount of money that must go to state, which is added to the value of the product. And therefore, the gross domestic product at market price becomes this amount. Minus 1 for any irrelevant or faulty items or double counting. So one needs to know what do you add, because you cannot go back once you are at gross value added price at basic price. Go and fetch or go and take items that do not form part of this or that have already been calculated. That becomes a double counting. You are adding a figure that has been added, making the value looks bigger when actually the value is not as you have reflected it. That was a problem with most learners, and I think teachers will help the learners with this, with using different question papers. This can be overcome very easily. Discuss the economic indicators relating to productivity, labor productivity, capital productivity, multi-factor productivity, and remuneration productivity. This has to do with the amount of goods that have been produced. Productivity is the increase of products with the input. In this case, the economic indicator that was to be discussed is the one that has to do with productivity. I think I went back and showed you the economic indicators as well as the social indicators. So here we have the labor productivity. To measure the labor productivity, real GDP should be divided by the number of workers employed for the number of years to construct an index number for the year. In other words, if we have here labor productivity, real GDP, the amount of goods must be divided by the number of people who have produced those goods. Then we can have an idea of what is the size of production, more or less. And then capital productivity refers to a change in output in relation to an increase in capital investment. How much of the GDP do we have with the increase in the capital? Multi-factor productivity, where we used more than one factors in order to increase the GDP, or the effect on GDP using more than one factor. Right, remuneration per worker. If the labor productivity increases by less than the wages, inflationary pressure will occur and the business cycle may turn unfavorable. Unemployment may increase. If then we have less wages. If labor productivity increases by less than the wages, remember the labor productivity, we have already referred to it. And if that happens, but the wages are less, then we have an inflationary pressure that may occur, and then the situation is unfavorable and people may end up without jobs. Please do read the rest of the remaining. Argue how free trade rather than protectionism will favor countries. There was a problem with this question. A lot of learners chose only to answer one of the two. They would only explain free trade and say nothing at all about protectionism. As a result, this question was not well answered. A lot of learners lost marks here because they were not doing any comparison, despite the fact that when marking, sometimes the comparison was not so looked into as to the facts relating to the two aspects. For example, under free trade, you had to say economics of scale will exist. The more there's free trade, the less cost, and then the unit cost, the cost per unit will be decreased. Whereas with protectionism, the decreased rate, higher unit cost might lead to these economies of scale. In other words, if you are comparing the two, you are saying free trade is better because you have an advantage of less cost per unit. But with this one, there's more, it's not cost effective. In other words, it may lead to these economies of scale. Now you go to under free trade, countries will benefit from comparative advantage through specialization, while protectionism will reduce the ability of other countries to enter the local markets. So here you are also again saying if there's free trade, then you have comparative advantage. Remember comparative advantage when one country can produce an item at a lower cost than the rest of the world, the others. And then here, if we have protectionism, the market cannot be penetrated into because of that, what can I call it, a blanket or whatever it is. But the country is protected from trading. Free trade promotes innovation through competition. Protectionism limits competition and thus reduces innovation. These are the things that one needed to say as the question demanded. This was the response elicited. Argue how free trade, in other words, you were to say free trade is better than protectionism. That was then the last question of question 4. The essay questions. This is the last section of the paper, and then one had to choose only one question of the 2 questions here. Very important, your response must have an introduction for 2 marks, and the body has 2 parts. The body must have the main part, which is normally very content based, and then additional part, although it's content related, but your understanding is of paramount here. You give your own opinion, you assess, you evaluate, you come to a conclusion, and so on for 10 marks. And then you draw a conclusion. When you do the conclusion, you do not necessarily repeat everything you said. When you do an introduction, you don't necessarily repeat what was said in the instruction for you to write the essay. But you can here say, maybe give a definition or a summary of what is to be discussed, and then not necessarily repeating word for word what you are going to discuss. And remember, the essay in economics, it doesn't have to be as paragraphed as your language essays. You can do it in a point form. Then we are not missing any of the facts you stated. Right, let's look at macroeconomics. Question 5. Government is constantly trying to achieve specific objectives to improve the standard of living of the nation. Discuss the macroeconomic objectives of the state in South Africa's economy. That was the first part, the macroeconomic objectives. The second part of the question, in your opinion, to what extent has South African government achieved these objectives? What this then says, when you have said what the general aims of the country, the macro objectives of the country, then you refer to the same objectives that you have talked about. Let's say, for example, you said the objective is to get full employment. Then here, as you are giving your opinion, you need to refer to full employment and say, I think they have achieved or they have not achieved for reason 1, 2, 3. That is what was the kind of response was elicited from you with this question. Let us then look at the memo itself. Introduction, the government provides goods and services that are undersupplied by the market and therefore plays a major role in economic activity and guiding and shaping the economy. Any other thing that has to do with the government providing the services, the aims of the government objectives would have been accepted. But what was not acceptable, which the majority of learners did, was they went back here and said, the government is constantly trying to achieve specific objectives to improve the standard of living of the nation. They did that, and that was their introduction. And that is not acceptable. That is a mere repetition of what was here, and you are not introducing your topic at all. Therefore, avoid verbatim writing of what was given to you as part of your introduction. Right, there is the main body of the government objectives, economic growth. As you can see, although there's 1 mark for the headings now, but you still need to have the headings. Economic growth refers to an increase in the production of the goods and services. We measure it in terms of the real GDP, and then you go on explain the economic growth And what do you mean by real GDP? How do we calculate that? Then you give the formula. You only give the formula, you don't give any figures here, there are no figures. Then if the objective is full employment, you explain what full employment is. And then you explain all other elements that has to do with full employment. Like for example, it says here, it is when all people who want work, who are looking for work, must be able to get their job. That is full employment. And then you have other aspects then. The other aspects then that can be explained. High levels of employment is the most important objective of the government. As you know, in South Africa, whenever there is a budget speech, employment will be referred to in many ways by the president here. Exchange rate stability. The economy must be managed effectively, and effective fiscal and monetary policy must be used to keep the exchange rate relatively stable. Remember the exchange rate, the buying of one country from another, the rate at which that buying takes place, and so on. And then the managing of the floating exchange rate that was referred to in the other question. And then the price stability, referring to the prices, cause stable prices cause better results in terms of job creation and economic growth, like maintaining of the inflation within the target of 3 to 6. Remember, it is now a bit high, slightly higher than this, but we are striving as a country to stay within the 3 and 6. The more stable the prices are, the better the economic growth and increase in job creation. Right, and then we have the other objectives like economic equity or fairness, where redistribution of wealth is attempted so that to lessen the situation where the richer are too rich, and then we have the very other ones who are so economically disadvantaged, it does not become funny. So with the economic equity, we say there's redistribution of income and wealth that is necessary. South Africa uses a progressive income tax. This is one way of doing it, where we say, okay, the ones who are earning higher must be taxed more, the ones who are earning less must be taxed less, and other means like the cash grants to the poor, trying to give a child support grant, disability, and the others to ensure that we lessen the gap between the rich and the poor. That is all what economic equity is all about. And then the other aim is that of the balance of payment equilibrium, the surplus or the deficit. Now I cannot even hear myself. The surplus or the deficit on the trade balance should be diminished by limiting the imports and promoting the exports. Remember, if we import too much, this is not good for the country, because what happens, we have a negative balance, which is the deficit on the balance of payment. So in order for us to have a healthy position, exports must be more than the imports. Then we are here, surplus. That is the healthy situation, which is very difficult to attain. It can be done by foreign trade policy, which focuses on export promotion, import substitution, and protection. If you remember, this was also a question somewhere in the objective questions. Therefore, if we can encourage exports and then we try to produce as much as local products, try to protect local industries from harmful activities such dumping and others, then we may strive or may get there in a way. Right, so if any of these were in your discussion, then you were qualifying for 26 marks. Right. Sorry for that. Additional part. That is the one that we said you must give your own opinion. Remember, like I said initially, the way the question has been phrased is such that you qualify what you have discussed in terms of the real situation as you see it. That is why we say in your own opinion. But that is guided by the content. For example, if we talk about the economic growth that we talked about previously, we say South Africa targets 4 to 5% economic growth. Previously, South Africa had about 5% economic growth and so on. If you qualify full employment, you can always say, compared to foreign countries, unemployment is very high. So anything that you discuss about unemployment, about unemployment, saying we do not have, the unemployment has increased. Even if you have not specifically used this, but we can tell that you are on full employment and you say it has not been reached, 1, 2, 3, 4, that would be acceptable. The same with the exchange rate, the same with the price stability, and the same with economic equity. Like economic equity has improved in many areas because people can see affirmative action, people can see people getting grants, people can see progressive systems still taking place, and so on. So you go on and on with that, and you then conclude your story by saying maybe you'll use the same one. While some successes have been achieved by the government, the fulfilling of some of the objectives are compromised by factors like lack of accountability, corruption, budgeting, nepotism, incompetence, or you could use your own conclusion, like say maybe generally most of these objectives have not been achieved. Maybe you would have mentioned those or you would not have mentioned them, but it gives us the gist of how you conclude your discussion. That is why we have accept any other relevant higher order conclusion. That is the end of that question then. We go to economic pursuits, question 6, which is either that one or this one when you write. And then we have 35 minutes only. Since 1994, the South African government has developed different strategies to transform the economy. Discuss the following South African growth and development strategies in detail. It is very important, guys, my candidates, to look at the question and respond accordingly. It says here, discuss the following South African growth and development strategies in detail, and not any other strategy, which is what some of the candidates did. They discussed things that were not asked. The only thing that you had to discuss was National Skills Development Strategy, the New Growth Path, the National Development Plan, and then for the additional part, you must evaluate the strategies used in South Africa regarding. That is all that was required from you. And most of this content is there in your Mind the Gap, especially. Introduction. Almost 30% of South African population is absolutely poor. Therefore, poverty is serious policy matter for the government. If you said anything around the strategies, even if you did not necessarily explaining these, but giving a general overview of what is happening, that would have been acceptable. But what would not have been acceptable, which a lot of people lost their 2 marks, was to say, since 1994, the South African government has developed different strategies to transform the economy. No. That is rewriting this. If you talked about maybe since 1994, the standard of living has improved because we have different strategies that are used to ensure that perhaps could have helped, but not rewriting what you have already been given. The main part here, national skills development was to be discussed. There are things that you had to discuss about the national skills development strategy. This policy provided the framework for skills development in a workplace. GIPSA is a short to medium-term mechanism to fast-track the objectives of NSDS. But most of the candidates here failed to explain that the national skills development is actually for people who are already working. We try to develop to make them better people to improve their productivity. That is what we failed to find from most of the responses here. And they were talking about things that do not necessarily here. They say people are helped with unemployment and what not, but that was not explaining the NSDS. The three processes for implementation was it focuses on productive citizens, it focuses on equality, quality training, and skills development in workplace. Focuses on institutional learning. Guys, you need to know the different strategies and what specifically are they trying to address. Right, the new growth path. It aims to enhance growth, create employment, and greater equity. It was announced in October 2010, and the main focus was to create the 5 million jobs over the 10-year period. Can you see? It is important that you must understand what each strategy is actually trying to address, because some are to create new jobs, some the job is already there to better people, some to focus on the youth, and so on and so on. And therefore, the focus is very important as you discuss the different strategies. Let us go on. Key areas where jobs can be created. There you have them: infrastructure expansion, agriculture, and the others. Pardon me for not reading everything. National Development Plan. Here, eliminate poverty and reduce inequality. Why? To reduce inequality, economic growth, an inclusive economy, to build capabilities. Economic transformation, enhance capability of the state and leaders working together to solve complex problems. What was this NDP for? Job creation, reduce unemployment. That was the aim of the NDP, and that is still the aim of the NDP. And you look at the NDP, and its proposal will need to be implemented in the right order over the next 17 years, and it will shape the budget allocation during the period. So one needs to have these points in order to explain the NDP. And those critical actions is part of the explanation. Right, and then if we look at the additional part, then you have all the South African public finances were established with the public debt to GDP ratio and so on and so on. In other words, when you look at this explanation, although this has not been tabled necessarily with specific strategies, but if you look at this, we need to be able to relate them to the strategies that were discussed before. And then, or if that was not how you presented your opinion, then you could have gone through this other route of looking at policies like the usage of gear, the usage of the RDP, and so on. And this is still acceptable, as this were the means to achieve. In conclusion, it is debatable whether the new strategies implemented will be successful in addressing the various economic objectives, because the past policies have failed to meet their targets, like ASGISA. Accept any other relevant higher order conclusion, Or you could say perhaps, here they say it is debatable, but you could maybe have said they have been successful because you are seeing a lot of things. Maybe you want to refer back to the strategies themselves, one or two, that because of those strategies you can see that people are living now in better conditions, or whatever the case may be in your conclusion. Right, this is just what I said. You must stay with me for a while. I'm now about to conclude, and this, you know, I'm just reminding you, remember one more time that in paper 1 you have 150 marks, you write for 1.5 hours, and you cannot afford not to know which questions you are going to answer in the examination. The topics that you are doing, the main topics will be the macroeconomics as well as the economic pursuits. Under macroeconomics, it's circular flow, business cycle, public sector, foreign exchange market, protectionism, and free trade. The topics under economic pursuits is growth and development, industrial development policies, economic and social performance indicators that we sort of gone home with in this paper. And now what I want to say to you, if you can focus on one of the topics which you are strong in, the chances of you doing better in this examination are very huge. Let me make an example using the marks. If you go to question 1, which is compulsory, you are plus minus having, let's take maybe you are strong in macroeconomics. Then you have, for the marks that you have for question 1, let's go back a bit, let's go back, can you get there? If you go to question 1, let's see, if you go to question 1, for an example, you have here 30 marks. Of these 30 marks, 15 of this would be, say, we are making use of macroeconomics, will be macroeconomics. So you are working out of 15 marks already from here. Now you choose maybe in question 2, macroeconomic question, and that question will be a 40-mark question. Now how many marks are you working out of just on macroeconomics? It's 40 plus the 15. It's 40 plus the 15. It gives you how much? It gives you about 55. So you are answering macroeconomics out of 55 already. Remember, in this section you are choosing 2 questions. Now the questions is the macro, the combination, and the pursuit. Now if you chose the macro and then you choose another question, which is the combination, let's say we said it is about 55. Now you choose another question which gives you about 20. The 55 plus the 20 gives you about 75. Where is the 20 from? Because it is a combination question, assuming that the macro has 20 and the pursuit has 20. So you have the 20. So we are talking the 20, the 40, and the 15. 20, 40, 70. You've got 20 plus 40 is 70 plus 15. It's about 65. Am I right? Let me just add correctly. Let's just add correctly together so that I'm accurate in what I'm saying. Let's say question 1. Question 1, we said, I want us to see it as we talk about it. We said we are talking about, let's look at the marks. It's 30 marks. We say 15 of that is at least macroeconomics. We go to section B, and when you go to section B, let's say you decided to choose macroeconomics, and therefore one question that you have chosen, which is purely macroeconomics, will be 40 marks. So if it is 40 marks, then you already are working out of 55 marks. And then let's suppose you choose a question like the one we have just done in question 4, where it's a combination. Now it's a 40 mark, maybe the 20 mark is only for the macro. Then we are talking about the 75 marks that you'll be working out of. And then let's suppose that you also choose now in the essay, you choose the 40 mark question. You have 70 here, you have around 7 plus 4 will give us what? 7 plus 4 will give us, okay, you more or less have around, say, 115. I may not be accurate, maybe you have 115. You already are working out of 115 only on macroeconomics. So if you have done a lot of work on macroeconomics, then the chances of you getting a lot of marks is there. Then you can answer now. In that objective questions in question 1, you'll still be able to understand some of the questions because you would have also studied that module or the topic, but without necessarily giving it equal attention as the other one, which is the macroeconomics. And then maybe in the combination question, also you can be able to answer some of the questions, because with the economic pursuits, you also have certain things like explaining the data response, getting the marks from the data response itself, and so on. Now you are working for 150 marks. If you are working out of 150 for macro, 115 or so for macro, and then you have these other marks that you can collect in the objective questions, and these other marks that you can collect in the combination question, you definitely must pass. You definitely must pass. So do as many questions as it is possible in the topic you feel strong in. And then do not neglect the other topic, but focus more, put more energy where you know you can collect as many marks as it is possible. My supplementing candidates, I wish you very well, and I would like to say to you, one of the most common causes of failure is the habit of quitting when one is overtaken by a temporary defeat. You not making it in November was just a temporary defeat. You cannot quit now. You can still make it. Just believe in yourself. If you say you have failed, you are right. But if you say you are going to make it, remember, you are also right. Good luck.